Jerusalem, a city that has stood at the crossroads of history for nearly 5,000 years. A place where faith, politics, and empire have collided countless times, leaving behind a story unlike any other on earth. It is a city holy to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, a single piece of land that three great religions have all called their own. Because of this, it has also been one of the most fought-over cities in human history, changing hands more than 40 times, and serving as both a beacon of faith and a battleground of blood. But how did this place, which began as little more than a small settlement beside a water spring, become the holiest city in the world? And why has it remained at the very center of conflict for millennia? To answer that, we need to go back to the very beginning, long before the great empires and long before the temples and churches, to the moment when the first settlers built their homes around a simple spring of water. The earliest roots of Jerusalem can be traced as far back as 3000 BC. At this time, the land was dry, rocky, and largely unwelcoming. But there was one source of life, the Gihon Spring. This natural spring provided the precious water needed to survive, and it was here that early inhabitants founded a small community. What started as a handful of huts and walls would, over the centuries, grow into a city that would shape the destiny of nations. By around 2000 BC, Jerusalem was already being mentioned in Egyptian records under the name Urushalim, meaning City of Shalom, possibly referring to a local Canaanite god of dusk or peace. The settlement at this stage was controlled by the Canaanites, who fortified it with stone walls to protect their lifeline, the water source. Though small, the city's position between Egypt and Mesopotamia made it strategically important, and this ensured that it would never remain untouched by the powers of its age. By 1500 BC, Jerusalem had come under Egyptian influence as part of the vast New Kingdom. Egypt's empire stretched from the sands of the Sahara to the mountains near modern Turkey, and Jerusalem was just one of many outposts within its territory. Yet even then, its religious and cultural weight was beginning to shape. Egypt's grip weakened by the 12th century BC during what historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse. This was a period when great kingdoms crumbled and chaos swept across the Mediterranean world. Out of this chaos, new groups emerged to claim their place. Among them were the Israelites, a people who, according to biblical tradition, would soon make Jerusalem the heart of their story. By around 1000 BC, the figure of King David is said to have captured the city and made it the capital of a new kingdom of Israel. This marked the beginning of Jerusalem's transformation from a small Canaanite stronghold into a spiritual and political center. Under David's son, King Solomon, a magnificent temple was built, known later as Solomon's Temple. It stood as a symbol of the covenant between the people and their God, and it made Jerusalem the beating heart of Judaism. From that moment on, Jerusalem was no longer just another ancient city. It was a holy city, and that status would ensure that everyone who ruled the region, from empires to conquerors, would seek to control it. After the reign of King Solomon, the United Kingdom of Israel soon fractured. Around the 9th century BC, the northern part became the Kingdom of Israel, while the southern part, with Jerusalem as its capital, became the Kingdom of Judah. From this point forward, Jerusalem's destiny would be tied to the survival of Judah. For the next 4 centuries, Jerusalem grew as the cultural and spiritual center of the Jewish people. The Great Temple stood proudly, and religious traditions were deepened, but being surrounded by powerful neighbors meant that Jerusalem was never safe from invasion. Egypt to the south, Assyria to the northeast, all were hungry for dominance in the region. The city survived many of these pressures, but in the 6th century BC, its fate took a dramatic turn. Assyria, once the dominant power, collapsed. In its place rose Babylon, ruled by the mighty king Nebuchadnezzar II. Determined to secure his empire, Nebuchadnezzar marched westward, and in 597 BC, he besieged Jerusalem. The city fell, and though he placed it under his control, resistance did not die out. Just a decade later, rebellion broke out again. Furious at the defiance, Nebuchadnezzar returned in 587 BC. This time, there was no mercy. Jerusalem was captured, the Temple of Solomon was burned to the ground, and much of the population was exiled to Babylon. This was the first great destruction of Jerusalem, and it marked the beginning of what Jewish history remembers as the Babylonian exile. The holy city lay in ruins, its people scattered. For nearly 50 years, Jerusalem remained under Babylonian rule, but empires rise and fall, and Babylon itself soon met its conquerors. In 539 BC, the Persians, under Cyrus the Great, swept across Mesopotamia and overthrew Babylon. Unlike Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus was known for his tolerance. He allowed the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland, and under his decree, the rebuilding of Jerusalem began. The Second Temple rose where the first had once stood, restoring the city's role as a spiritual home. For the next 2 centuries, Jerusalem remained under Persian control. It was not entirely free, but it was allowed a degree of autonomy to practice its faith and traditions. The city was rebuilt, its people returned, and Jewish life flourished again. But the peace would not last. In 332 BC, a young conqueror from Macedonia stormed into the region. His name was Alexander the Great. Having crushed the Persian Empire in his lightning campaigns, Alexander claimed Jerusalem as part of his vast empire, stretching from Greece to India. His sudden conquest changed the cultural balance of the city. Greek language, customs, and philosophy began to take root alongside Jewish traditions, marking the start of a long and complex struggle between local faith and foreign influence. Alexander's empire did not survive long after his death in 323 BC. His generals carved up his lands, and Jerusalem fell into the hands of different dynasties, each trying to stamp its mark on the holy city. For the Jews, this period brought both opportunity and tension, as Hellenistic culture spread and the question arose, should Jerusalem embrace these new ways or cling tightly to its ancient identity? After Alexander's death, his empire shattered, and Jerusalem became a pawn in the struggles of his successors. At first, it fell under the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, then later under the Seleucids of Syria. Each empire saw the city as valuable, not only because of its location, but because controlling Jerusalem meant holding sway over a people deeply attached to their faith. By the 2nd century BC, the Seleucid rulers began pushing Greek culture aggressively in Jerusalem. Statues of foreign gods appeared, and traditional Jewish practices were restricted. To many, this was not simply political control, it was an attack on their very identity. The breaking point came under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a Seleucid king who tried to stamp out Jewish worship altogether. Outrage erupted, and in the 160s BC, a Jewish family known as the Maccabees rose in revolt. Against the odds, they drove out Seleucid forces and reclaimed Jerusalem. In 164 BC, they purified and rededicated the Second Temple, an event remembered to this day during the festival of Hanukkah. The success of the Maccabees gave rise to the Hasmonean Kingdom, a Jewish state with Jerusalem as its proud capital. For about a century, Jerusalem stood as the heart of an independent kingdom once again. Temples were restored, Jewish law guided daily life, and the city regained its sacred and political strength. But independence in the ancient world rarely lasted long. By the 1st century BC, a new power was emerging, Rome. Ambitious, disciplined, and unstoppable, the Romans were extending their influence across the Mediterranean. In 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey marched into Jerusalem, bringing the city under Roman authority. Though the Hasmonean line technically survived for a short while, true independence was gone. Not long after, Rome installed Herod the Great as a client king. Herod was a brilliant but ruthless ruler. He sought to win the loyalty of Rome while also leaving his mark on Jerusalem. To do this, he launched massive building projects. The Second Temple was expanded into a grand and magnificent structure, its courts and walls stretching higher and wider than ever before. Palaces, fortresses, and aqueducts were constructed, making Jerusalem both a jewel of Jewish pride and a showcase of Roman engineering.
Yet Herod's reign was also marked by cruelty. He ruled with an iron fist, silencing dissent and dealing harshly with rivals. For all the splendor he built, resentment simmered beneath the surface. The city was becoming increasingly divided, torn between loyalty to tradition and submission to empire. After Herod's death in 4 BC, Roman influence only deepened. The land of Judea became a Roman province, ruled directly by governors who cared little for Jewish traditions. Taxes were heavy and unrest grew. Out of this tension, a new movement began to stir, one that would forever change not just Jerusalem, but the entire world. By the 1st century CE, Jerusalem had become a bustling city under Roman rule. Its population may have reached close to 100,000 people, and the temple, expanded by Herod, towered as the center of Jewish religious life. Pilgrims traveled from far and wide to offer sacrifices and prayers, filling the streets with energy and devotion. It was during this period that a new voice emerged. In the nearby town of Bethlehem, Jesus of Nazareth was born. His life and teachings, though controversial in his own time, would eventually change the course of human history. Jesus visited Jerusalem on several occasions, and it was here, according to Christian tradition, that he was crucified under Roman authority and rose again. The followers of Jesus, led by his disciples, began spreading his message. Jerusalem became the birthplace of the Christian church, with small gatherings of believers meeting in secret at first and then growing in number. What had started as a Jewish movement soon transformed into a faith of its own, with Jerusalem as its spiritual heart. But the city was still deeply divided. Roman rule remained heavy-handed, and resentment boiled over among the Jewish population. In 66 CE, anger at high taxes, corruption, and the disrespect of Roman officials ignited a massive rebellion known as the First Jewish Revolt. Jerusalem became the center of resistance, and for a time, rebels drove out Roman forces. Rome, however, was not a power to be defied. In 70 CE, the Roman general Titus led a massive army to besiege Jerusalem. The siege was brutal. Hunger and disease swept the city as the Romans cut off supplies. Finally, after months of suffering, the walls were breached. The Romans stormed the city, setting fire to its buildings and tearing down its monuments. The Second Temple, the most sacred site of Jewish worship, was destroyed, leaving only a single section of its great outer wall. That remnant, now known as the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, remains one of the holiest places in Judaism to this day. The destruction was catastrophic. Thousands were killed, survivors were enslaved, and Jerusalem was left in ruins. But the city's story did not end there. The Romans rebuilt it as a colony, renaming it Aelia Capitolina. They banned Jews from entering except on certain holy days, hoping to erase its Jewish character altogether. For Christians, however, Jerusalem's importance continued to grow. The sites associated with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus became destinations for pilgrims. The seeds of a new faith had taken root, and Jerusalem, though devastated, remained at the center of it. By the 4th century, everything changed once again. The Roman Empire, which had long resisted Christianity, embraced it under Emperor Constantine. His mother, Helena, traveled to Jerusalem and identified the spot believed to be the site of Jesus' crucifixion and burial. Over it, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built in the year 335 CE. From that day on, Jerusalem became not only a sacred city for Jews, but also the holiest site in all of Christendom. With Christianity now the official faith of the Roman Empire, Jerusalem entered a new era, Under Byzantine rule, which lasted from the 4th to the 7th century, the city became a major Christian pilgrimage site. Churches, monasteries, and shrines were built, attracting believers from across the empire. The jewel of this period was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, constructed by Constantine in the 4th century and revered as the site of Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. Pilgrims wept and prayed in his courtyards, and Jerusalem's streets filled with traders and innkeepers serving the steady flow of travelers. Yet while Christians flourished, the Jewish presence in Jerusalem remained restricted. Jews were largely barred from living in the city, allowed only limited visits to mourn at the remains of the destroyed temple. For them, Jerusalem became a symbol of both hope and loss, the dream of return never fading.
But in the 7th century, the world shifted again. Far to the south, in Arabia, a new faith was rising: Islam. Within decades of the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632, Muslim armies expanded across the Middle East, toppling old empires and establishing a new order. In 638, Jerusalem was surrendered to Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second leader of the Islamic community. Unlike earlier conquerors, Umar entered the city peacefully. According to tradition, he respected its sacred places, ensuring protection for both Christians and Jews. For Muslims, Jerusalem held deep spiritual meaning. Islamic tradition teaches that the Prophet Muhammad was miraculously transported here during the night journey, before ascending to heaven. To honor this, the Umayyad caliphs built one of the most iconic structures in the city's history, the Dome of the Rock. Completed in 691, the golden domed shrine stood atop the Temple Mount, the very site where the Jewish temples had once stood. Its dazzling mosaics and inscriptions proclaimed the unity of God, marking Jerusalem as the third holiest city in Islam after Mecca and Medina. Nearby, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was also constructed, creating a grand sanctuary complex that still defines the skyline of Jerusalem today. The city, now sacred to three great faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, entered a new chapter as a crossroads of devotion. Under early Muslim rule, Jerusalem thrived as a place of learning, pilgrimage, and administration. Christians continued to live and worship there, Jews were gradually permitted to return, and Muslims made the city a spiritual center. For a time, a fragile coexistence took shape. But this peace would not last forever. As centuries passed, rival empires, crusaders, and conquerors would battle endlessly for control of Jerusalem, each determined to claim it for themselves. By the 11th century, Jerusalem stood under Muslim control, a vibrant city filled with shrines, markets, and pilgrims. But far away in Europe, a storm was gathering. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for Christians to retake the Holy Land, promising salvation to those who joined the cause. Tens of thousands of knights and peasants answered, launching what became known as the First Crusade. After a brutal journey across Europe and the Middle East, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem in 1099. What followed was one of the bloodiest episodes in the city's history. After a long siege, Crusader forces stormed the walls, slaughtering thousands of Muslims and Jews inside. Contemporary accounts describe streets running red with blood. The Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, making the city their capital. They rebuilt churches, fortified walls, and turned the Al-Aqsa Mosque into a palace for their kings. The Dome of the Rock was converted into a Christian church. For nearly a century, Jerusalem stood as the prized jewel of Crusader rule, attracting pilgrims and warriors from across Europe. But Muslim powers were far from defeated. In the 12th century, a new leader rose in Egypt and Syria, Salah ad-Din, known in the West as Saladin. Charismatic, devout, and skilled in war, Saladin united the Muslim world and launched a campaign to reclaim Jerusalem. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, his forces crushed the Crusader army. Soon after, Saladin marched into Jerusalem.
Unlike the Crusaders before him, he did not massacre the city's inhabitants. Instead, he allowed safe passage for Christians and restored Jerusalem's Islamic holy sites. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque were rededicated while Christian pilgrims still permitted to visit. This act of mercy became legendary, and Saladin's reputation as a chivalrous leader endured for centuries. Yet Jerusalem's fate remained uncertain. Over the next 100 years, the city changed hands multiple times, seized in later crusades, only to be reclaimed by Muslim forces again. By the late 13th century, however, the Crusader dream of holding Jerusalem faded. Muslim rulers firmly re-established control, and the Christian Crusader kingdoms collapsed along the coast. Still, the legacy of these wars left deep scars. Jerusalem had become a symbol of religious passion and conflict, fought over by armies who believed its stones held the key to heaven itself. As the medieval world gave way to new empires, Jerusalem once again stood at the crossroads. The coming centuries would see it ruled not by European knights or local dynasties, but by a new power rising from the heart of Anatolia, the Ottoman Turks. In 1517, the Ottoman Empire, led by Sultan Selim I, swept into the region and claimed Jerusalem. For the next 4 centuries, the city would remain under Ottoman rule. At first, this brought a degree of stability. The Ottomans invested in Jerusalem's defenses, most famously when Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent rebuilt its great walls in the 16th century, the very walls that still encircle the old city today. For Muslims, Jerusalem remained a holy city, with the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, home to the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, serving as a focal point of devotion. Christian pilgrims also continued to arrive in large numbers, visiting the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other sacred sites. Even Jews, though still marginalized, maintained a presence in the city, gathering in greater numbers around the Western Wall.
Yet, despite its sacred status, Jerusalem was no longer a major political or economic center. Under Ottoman rule, it became more of a provincial town, important for religion, but lacking the wealth and power of great imperial cities like Istanbul or Cairo. Life was often difficult. Poverty was widespread, infrastructure was neglected, and the population remained small, barely a few tens of thousands for much of this period. Still, Jerusalem retained its magnetism. Pilgrims of all 3 faiths continued to flow into the city, giving it an unusual diversity. In the narrow streets of the old city, Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, Jews, Turks, and Europeans lived side by side, each group clinging to its traditions. By the 19th century, global powers began to take greater interest in Jerusalem. European nations, seeking influence in the weakening Ottoman Empire, built consulates, schools, hospitals, and churches. Russia, France, and Britain all competed for a stake in the Holy City. Missionaries arrived, scholars studied its ancient past, and new neighborhoods sprang up outside the old walls. At the same time, the Jewish community began to grow as immigration increased, driven by waves of persecution in Europe and inspired by the dream of returning to Zion. By the late 1800s, Jewish neighborhoods expanded beyond the old city, laying the seeds of what would become modern Jerusalem. As the Ottoman Empire declined, Jerusalem became increasingly entangled in global politics. The city was no longer just a place of faith, it was becoming a pawn in the rivalries of empires. When World War I erupted, the fate of Jerusalem once again shifted. In 1917, British forces under General Edmund Allenby marched into the city, ending 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. Allenby entered humbly on foot through the Jaffa Gate, declaring respect for its sacred traditions. For the first time in centuries, Jerusalem had come under Western control again. But this was only the beginning of a new and turbulent chapter, one that would shape the modern Middle East. When British forces entered Jerusalem in 1917, they promised to protect the city's holy sites and respect its diverse communities. Soon after, the League of Nations granted Britain a formal mandate over Palestine, with Jerusalem as its crown jewel. But this new chapter quickly became one of rising tension. In 1917, the British government had issued the Balfour Declaration, supporting the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. For Jews, long scattered by exile and persecution, this fueled the dream of return. Jewish immigration increased steadily, with new neighborhoods, schools, and institutions rising in Jerusalem and beyond. For the Arab population, however, this promise felt like a betrayal. They too considered the land their home and feared being displaced. Jerusalem became the heart of the struggle, a city where Jewish and Arab aspirations collided. The 1920s and 1930s saw waves of unrest. Riots erupted at the Western Wall, strikes and protests swept the land, and clashes between Jewish and Arab communities turned violent. The British, caught in the middle, tried to impose order, but found themselves unable to satisfy either side. At the same time, global events made Jerusalem's role even more critical. The rise of Nazism in Europe and the horrors of the Holocaust drove desperate Jewish refugees toward Palestine. Tens of thousands arrived, seeking safety and a homeland. Arab resistance hardened, fearing the loss of their land and identity. By the 1940s, the situation was spiraling out of control. Britain, exhausted by World War II and unable to manage the conflict, handed the problem to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the UN proposed partitioning Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem set aside as an international city under UN administration. The plan was accepted by Jewish leaders, but rejected by Arab leaders. Violence broke out almost immediately. By 1948, the British withdrew and war erupted between Jews and Arabs. On May 14, 1948, Jewish leaders declared the independence of the State of Israel. Jerusalem was at the center of the conflict. Fierce battles raged in its streets. By the end of the war, the city was divided. West Jerusalem came under Israeli control, while East Jerusalem, with its old city, holy sites, and centuries of history, was held by Jordan. A no-man's land of barbed wire, walls, and armed guards cut through the heart of the city. For Jews, the new state marked the fulfillment of ancient hopes, yet the loss of the old city and the Western Wall was deeply painful. For Palestinians, it was a catastrophe, or the Nakba, which means the catastrophe, as hundreds of thousands were displaced, many fleeing through Jerusalem itself. The battle for Jerusalem was far from over. What had begun as a local struggle was becoming one of the most bitter and enduring conflicts of the modern era. After 1948, Jerusalem became a city divided. On one side, West Jerusalem was the capital of the new state of Israel, filled with government buildings, universities, and growing neighborhoods. On the other, East Jerusalem, with its old city, holy sites, and centuries of history, was held by Jordan. A no-man's land of barbed wire, walls, and armed guards cut through the heart of the city.
For nearly 2 decades, Jews were barred from visiting their holiest sites in East Jerusalem, including the Western Wall. Synagogues in the Old City lay in ruins, while access to Christian and Muslim sites remained under Jordanian control. Jerusalem, sacred to all 3 faiths, was fractured and scarred. The stalemate broke in June 1967, during the Six-Day War. In less than a week, Israel fought Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and emerged victorious. Israeli forces swept into East Jerusalem, capturing the Old City. Images of Israeli soldiers standing before the Western Wall, weeping and praying, spread across the world. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, Jews had control of their most sacred site. Israel quickly declared all of Jerusalem its united capital. The city's boundaries expanded, and new neighborhoods were built in the east. The Western Wall Plaza was cleared and transformed into a massive space for prayer. For many Jews, it was the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, Jerusalem reunited under Jewish rule. But for Palestinians, this was another wound. East Jerusalem, with its Arab population, became occupied territory. Families lost land and homes, and the dream of a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital grew more urgent. Tensions deepened as international powers debated the city's status. Most countries refused to recognize Israel's claim to all of Jerusalem, insisting its final status must be resolved through negotiation. From the 1970s onward, Jerusalem became a flashpoint of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Clashes erupted at holy sites, protests filled its streets, and waves of violence spread from its neighborhoods to the wider region. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, perched above the Western Wall, stood at the center of the tension, symbols of faith, pride, and contested sovereignty. Yet amid the conflict, Jerusalem continued to grow. It became Israel's largest city, home to Jews, Muslims, and Christians, each community fiercely attached to its traditions. Pilgrims from across the world still flocked to its sacred sites, walking the same ancient streets where prophets, kings, and conquerors once walked. By the late 20th century, peace efforts sought to resolve the conflict. The Oslo Accords of the 1990s raised hopes of compromise, but Jerusalem remained the hardest issue to settle. For Israelis, it was their eternal capital. For Palestinians, it was the heart of their future state. And for the world's billions of believers, it was a city that could never belong to one people alone. Jerusalem was no longer just an ancient city. It had become the center of one of the most complex and emotional struggles of the modern age. As the 21st century began, Jerusalem stood as both a thriving modern city and a flashpoint of global conflict. Its population grew rapidly, with Jews, Muslims, and Christians living side by side, yet often separated by deep mistrust. Skyscrapers arose beside ancient stone walls. Light rail cars glided through streets once crossed by Roman chariots, and the hum of modern life mixed with echoes of history. But the struggle over Jerusalem's identity only intensified. In 2000, the collapse of peace talks and the outbreak of the Second Intifada brought waves of violence to the city. Suicide bombings, military raids, and clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque turned Jerusalem into the heart of a conflict that seemed endless. In 2017, the United States formally recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, moving its embassy there. For Israelis, it was a long-sought acknowledgement of their sovereignty. For Palestinians, it was a devastating blow to their aspirations. Protests erupted, and once again, the city became the focus of global attention. Today, Jerusalem is a city of contradictions. It is deeply divided, yet fiercely united in its importance to billions. Pilgrims still journey from across the world to pray at the Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Festivals and prayers fill its plazas, even as political disputes threaten to tear its communities apart. For Jews, Jerusalem is the eternal capital, a dream restored after millennia of exile. For Christians, it is the city of Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. For Muslims, it is the blessed land of the Prophet's night journey. No other city carries such layers of meaning, such weight of history, such intensity of devotion. And yet beneath its tensions, Jerusalem remains more than just a place of conflict. It is also a symbol of resilience, survival, and faith. Empires have risen and fallen, conquerors have come and gone, yet Jerusalem endures. Its walls, its stones, and its people bear witness to the passage of time, a reminder that while power may shift, the sacred heart of this city beats on. Jerusalem is not simply the story of one people or one empire. It is the story of humanity, our struggles, our hopes, and our search for the divine. And so long as the world endures, the name of Jerusalem will never fade.